So very exciting to be doing this session today. With us, I've got a great panel of speakers. Today, we're going to be looking at the new global tech report that KPMG have released, and I've got three excellent representatives to talk about this today. We've got Matteo, Paul, and Barry, which I'll pass over to you in a second to do a quick introduction before we jump into this. Got a lot of detail I want to show, and also Trevor, who's joining partly from the AI Journal side and also his other interests within our different areas. So I'm really excited to look at the topics that we've got today. There's been a lot of fascinating stats that I've pulled out. I remember reading through it and helping with publish it through the AI Journal, and the feedback's been great from what I can see, and really appreciate all of you making the time to run through it. So I guess I'm going to start by going around the table. Matteo, if we start with you, please, sir, and then go to Paul, Barry, and then Trevor to yourself, and then we can jump into the agenda that we've got today, or the questions that I want to look at and do a bit of a deep dive around this exciting report. So over to you, Matthew.
Yeah. Hi, Tom. It's great to be with you here today. Matteo Colombo, I lead our Lighthouse business in the U.S. For those of you that are not familiar with our Lighthouse business, is where we manage the majority of emerging technology in KPMG, which includes digital architecture, includes emerging tech, things like Web 3.0, crypto, metaverse, but as well as more mature technologies such as cloud, data, and AI. So I manage this business for the US. Paul?
Thanks, Matteo, and good to be here. So my name is Paul Henninger. I have two roles at KPMG. I'm global head of our Lighthouse Center of Excellence, which Matteo more or less just explained. Our global role is to sort of coordinate multi-country activity around innovation and those types of emerging technologies, and how do we scale them, how do we work together on them. My day job, such as it is I'm head of what we call Connected Technology in the UK, which is our technology consulting organization, which includes Lighthouse and a number of other capabilities. Good to be here. Barry?
Yeah, very good. Thanks, Paul. And thanks, Tom and Trevor, for having us. Very excited about the conversation today. So I'm Barry Brunsman. I'm a Chicago-based partner. Like Paul, have two roles in the firm. I lead what we refer to as our CIO COE, very analogous to the team that Paul has described. We tend to focus a bit more around, I just probably call it technology function strategy and design. So a lot of the insights from this really feed into our day-to-day practice. And the CIO COE was a part of the team that was really responsible for crafting the survey, doing the analysis behind the survey, and ultimately resulting in the product that you've had a chance to take a look at. My day-to-day practice is really advising our clients on mostly IT operating model insights, as well as technology strategy more generally. So thrilled to be with you. Thank you so much.
Yep, Trevor Gormley. I sit on the board of the AI Journal. Span pretty much in every industry that I can get my tentacles into, from artificial intelligence to construction. I have been deep in the weeds in various industries, implementing technologies and working with C-suites on figuring out at a startup all the way to $100 million companies working on the best ways to implement technologies. So when I was reading this report, I got really excited because Tom asked to bring me in on this. And some of the findings in here are definitely very interesting, and I'm eager to kind of hear from everybody's feedback of what we're looking at over the next few years with technology integration with companies.
Great.
Yeah, I think it's brilliant. That's a great point, Trevor, because it's to lead us into what I wanted to bring us all together today for. And reading through it when I first saw it, I look at a lot of reports and I really delve my head into a lot of research. I love research, which is the idea why I started AI Journal. And when you see things like this, the stats that you pulled out, it's really fascinating. So I want to start with you, Matteo. You mentioned from the Lighthouse side and what you're doing. And I want to pose this question to you because it's clear that this is an area that people want to invest in, or companies want to invest in, industries want to invest in, because the stat was 99% of executives have generated return. So that means this is working if you have the right strategy and the right adoption. So these insights kind of surprised me. Kind of did in a very good way, and kind of did in other angles. But this one in particular, because sometimes you always see, and I'm not a fan of negative stats saying how many digital transformation initiatives fail. And in this case, it's showing people actually can succeed if you have the right strategies, right formulas, right people, right tactics in place. So maybe starting with you, Matteo, and then we can share around the table as a roundtable discussion. What was it as much a surprise to you as it was to me to see this figure, or maybe you want to touch on another figure? But that one stuck out to me in particular. What do you think?
Yeah, no, I think it's a great point, and I think you were very astute in call this one out, right? Because it's top of mind in as we think about the recessionary posture that we might be facing, whether it's globally, certainly is there for us in the U.S. as well. And so the number one question that we typically face when we look at a technology market at large is, are organization going to slow down on their investment? Are they going to have second thoughts? What if they are going to slow down? On what are they going to slow down? And this research, which is very recent, is showing us there is no intention to slowing down. And the reason why there is no intention to slowing down is because, maybe unlike some of earlier technology we have seen, the ROI is there, right? And is there across the board. The lagger are still getting ROI in the 5% type of profit improvement. The leaders, they triple that, right? Yeah. But regardless, across the board, consistently we're hearing this head of technology say, I'm getting value out of my digital journey, whether it's with cloud, whether it's with data, and I'm not going to stop doing that. What's more interesting is because a lot of the motivation and the drivers are engagement, related, whether it's client, customer, whether it's employees. Emerging technology are also continue to be top of mind, right? Typically, when the economy changes, those are the first thing that get cut, right? Yeah, it's interesting to play around with metaverse and Web 2.0, but when my budget get reduced, that's the first thing I'm going to stop. And we haven't seen that either, right? Obviously it's less prominent than the investment we see in cloud and data, but the numbers show that emerging technology will continue to be an integral part of that journey. And so that's for somebody that's working with those emerging technologies, that's very exciting.
I don't know. Was there anything, Paul and Barry, from your side when you're looking at these stats? Because I mean, another one that stuck out to me was the cloud adoption. I remember ringing Daniel and I was just like, "This is crazy!" Like cloud is a big area for me, especially since the massive movement from Microsoft and in 2014 to move things towards the cloud and make that big push. I mean, 9 out of 10. That's it's a crazy stat to think that it's so high. What did you make of that?
Yeah, I mean, maybe a couple of things. First, building a little bit on Mateo's comment and then coming around to the cloud piece, because that cloud stat stood out to me as well. Maybe a little bit not what I was expecting. I think what we were seeing in terms of motivation for digital transformation largely being customer experience, so front office facing, if you will, points to a higher likelihood of a measurable return on investment as opposed to maybe a more back office efficiency oriented transformation. So I think there might be a little bit about the type of transformation people were facing and therefore the likelihood of success. So interesting for us also the prominence of customer experience across a number of different categories, including the driver for digital transformation. I also think, within that 99% stat, as Mateo is suggesting, there's a stratification. So I wouldn't say winners or losers, but people who are relatively pulling ahead from the crowd, which I think creates some lessons learned for organizations as they move forward. The cloud story was interesting because in previous of these surveys, we had talked about cloud as an emerging technology, and it's very, very clear that that's the wrong way to think about cloud, that people are well down the path. A shocking percentage describe themselves as complete with their journey, but I suspect there are contextual things that lead to that statistic. And maybe more importantly, that there was a strong satisfaction with the progress to date. So I ultimately interpret that as great progress. No longer think about this as an emerging technology. It's just a technology shift. And I don't mean just to diminish it. But it is a technology shift. And within that satisfaction, again, though, relative winners and people who are not performing quite so well. So a ways to go, great momentum, but lessons to be learned about how you make sure organizations are on the winning side of that transformation as they continue to move forward.
I love it.
And I think as Barry said, there's a couple other statistics in the report that explain to some extent what I agree are fairly surprising levels of adoption. I mean, as someone who used to do data for a living, anytime you see 99% of anyone saying anything, it's sort of like it seems you have to sort of bang the side of the computer and see if there's something wrong. But I think what explains it is things like 32% of the respondents being highly satisfied with the ROI that they're getting from digital transformation, and significant percentage, I think it was 20%, said they were achieving 20% or 11% or greater return on investment. And when we go out there to deploy an AI solution or to lead a digital transformation, you tend to try to be conservative. 5%, 6% return on investment is kind of great, and you don't want to kind of create expectations. But the fact that a significant group of people are experiencing double-digit returns, I think is why you're seeing the momentum. It's not just that everyone kind of academically believes that, of course, the future is technology. You don't have to, I don't have to look, beyond the screen in front of me to believe the future or the present is technology. But the fact that it is actually actively generating value through the solution to business problems is what's creating the momentum.
Yeah. I was going to say, Trevor, I'd love to know what you think. I know you're that's a great point, Paul and Barry, because I know, Trevor, you're involved with a lot of AI development on AI companies. How did you see it? How did you see it?
Yeah, I think what's interesting, as we're talking about companies who are looking at their digital transformation, is I think the maturing cycle is starting to get to a point where the returns are becoming more apparent, right? I feel like there were a lot of companies that probably tried a lot of different things that were very hesitant about reinvesting dollars after something didn't work. And I think, there were interesting risks or variables that I think really impeded a lot of, I think if we were to look back, 7 or 8 years ago, I think the culture aspect as a risk factor to the digital transformation probably would have been higher. So I think you're starting to see some of the skewing away from normal risk variables. And one of the stats obviously is cyber, and cyber is increasing, right? The resistance from cyber teams is basically saying you got to slow down a little bit and maybe not adopt as many strategies. And I think that's been, kind of an interesting point to read about and watch, because obviously all the innovators and people in my space, like artificial intelligence, we're kind of pushing the envelope on really innovative technology. And, there are people on the other side of the coin that say, we need to slow down. We need to be more aware of the risks to our company. But I do think one thing that's interesting that I did want to point out is the expected downscale over time after hitting implementation. And I don't know, this just may be me, but obviously economies of scale is a great, factor of everyday life. And we can continue to do that. TVs have gone down, 800%, over the last 10 years or whatever, in terms of cost. But I think one thing that is kind of naive, perhaps from some of the executives that, that were surveyed is looking at, it's not just a 2 or 3 year thing, right? There's going to be more innovative technology, and you've just got to really weigh that ROI versus the cost of that implementation. And I think that the talent thing is another big thing I'd love to talk about. I think the talent risk of implementation of this technology is a huge barrier to a lot of companies' hesitation as to why we wouldn't invest in tech.
Right.
I think it's a good point, Trevor, and I think you tend to, in some of the very large transformations that we're part of, you tend to think of it in terms of cost to achieve and cost to maintain. Cost to maintain is always lower than cost to achieve, because if you were going to sort of run at some $20 million a year or whatever to forever, then people would get a little concerned. I think the reality is, and this comes back a little bit to Barry's point, where there was a curious statistic about people being at the end of their journey. It's these things happen in phases to some extent, and the phase we're in right now is really exciting, because as you pointed out, we're starting to, after a series of productive failures, start to see the real impact of the right approach, the right constellation of technologies, of strategies, of things like that, and that sort of downswing is we shouldn't have to spend the same amount of money to maintain the tech that we've just put in place. As Matteo said earlier, emerging technology, for better or worse, probably for better, will ensure that the next wave has another cost to achieve and another cost to maintain, and then another one and another one. So you'll see that kind of cycle, even though probably the spend over time doesn't appreciably actually, as a whole, constrict.
And maybe I want to touch upon your comment, Trevor, around talent, right? So it was so evident in our survey, in our study, that talent is the number one constraint into the journey. And I would say maybe as an industry, I'm talking about the service industry and large professional services, we might be in a bit complacent into that. Obviously, this is a factor of the outsourcing movement that we have seen for the past 10 years, right? Where across the board, we have seen organization outsourcing their engineers. And now all of a sudden they realize that they don't have enough, and and in-source that capability is not easy because there is a broader scarcity, particularly in industry that you don't expect, right? Obviously we heard about scarcity in tech, and they're being fairly loud around that, but it's across the board, right? And so organizations now are really struggling with that dichotomy and say, what is the right strategy for me? How quickly can I insource? How can I attract that talent? How can I create career paths that are compelling for those people in my organization? How do I rebrand myself to be attractive to this persona, to this really category of skills? So that's a big challenge. And I'm not surprised it's by far the number one.
Yeah, and I kind of building on that, I think underneath that is perhaps an even more worrying story in that while it's not evident in the data in this survey, I think it certainly fits with my own practice experience. The gap that we're talking about is not generically IT skills. That's an issue, I think, in and of itself, but it's really architects, engineers, cybersecurity specialists. And these are people with depth, that are not easily developed or even purchased, as Matteo suggested, through an outsourcing market. And so I think the amount of time it's going to take us to get back on top of that scarcity issue is, quite lengthy. I think it'll be a challenge for us. Engineers, architects, deep cybersecurity folks are not a commodity skill set. And it's really those sorts of people that are really required to drive this agenda that we're seeing indicated through the survey forward.
And I think that comes back to that 99%, adoption of digital transformation. I mean, we know this both because of our own, efforts to build teams and build people, as well as serving clients. If you have good engineering skills, and certainly AI skills and cyber skills, you could go work, 3 dozen different industries. You can definitely work in big tech, you can work in small tech, you can work at, the big 4, you can work at the tech consulting firms, the strategy firms, the boutique firms, you can work at a hospital. I was talking to a client the other day that's a mid-sized department store. That's, they're a well-run place. They were talking about how they built a 250-person AI and cloud center of excellence offshore. And I was a little bit surprised, if I'm honest, because it's not exactly the type of organization you would have thought would have any kind of scale on that at all. But the point is, everybody's doing this, and the talent, it's not exactly just fungible. It's not like you move from, a social media company to, the NHS in the UK or something like that without kind of taking a little time to understand what the hell's going on. But it is fungible. You can go get a job lots of places, and because everyone's doing this, there's an inevitable shortage of talent, which may persist. It will almost certainly persist despite, kind of economic fluctuations for a long time.
That's a good point. And those are all great points that you've raised. So I want to look at the next point, which I have on something I wanted to bring to all of you and get your feedback on. When I was reading through it, there's a few things. I think budget inadequacy was highlighted as an issue in the report. There was another one that, Trevor, you were touching on. 58% of cybersecurity teams admit that they're behind schedule. There's other areas thinking, and while how quickly people want to do it, they want to do it within 2 years. They want to really get to it. So where does that stand? Maybe Trevor, from your point first, and then going around to Matteo, Paul, and Barry. When you're trying to, I don't know if I'd call that necessarily tech trading debt, as it's been called tech debt in the report. But how do you think there's that opportunity, maybe from an outside perspective, Trevor, of the different industries you're involved with, to make sure people can use it? Because it's not just in physical, it's in Web 3.0, blockchain, all these emerging technology platforms to make it very transferable, as you touched on, Paul and Matteo and Barry. What do you make of all of it, Trevor?
I mean, I think there's a couple of things, especially as it's been brought up, economic turmoil can sometimes be good. And as much as COVID did bad, I think it's actually forced a lot of companies' hands to get clever about talent and, the things that we were talking about. I think one of the things that is difficult and has always been difficult in technology is actually rationalizing and putting dollar figures to the ambiguities that a lot of people may not understand. And I think obviously as the risk profile per technology that you deploy varies from segment to segment. I think the interesting bit, is what you had talked about, that I think it said 50% of companies or a significant majority are less than, their tech initiative is less than 10% of their budget. And if you think about it, like, we look at in the ride-hail space, the Uber and Lyfts of the world and their talent acquisition and all of these things that they're having, issues with. And the tech initiatives, in terms of cost and to implement or cost to develop and the scheduling, the ROIs, if you think about it, are comparable, if not more favorable to technology. So I think companies just have to get, a little bit more comfortable with understanding that, if they actually dig into a lot of the numbers and they think about where their personnel is spending the majority of the time, they can find solutions that will eliminate millions of dollars in inefficiency for the person that they're paying $300,000 to $500,000 a year and allow them to be more efficient. And I think that's the frontier that more and more companies are getting comfortable with and expanding the budget because, people, like the strategists we have on the call are going in and saying, look, you can absolutely do this. And you've got a lot of talent that's, doing things that we can either automate or be more intelligent around. So I think with budget inadequacy, I'm hopeful that, in terms of looking at either, growing top line margin or reducing, the inefficiencies on bottom line, that companies will feel more, capable of adopting a larger budget for these, these initiatives.
Barry and Paul and Matteo, I'd love to know what you think, because I think what I picked up from that is the gaining confidence to navigate it all, right? There's a lot of different technologies. Are they using the right technology? And a lot of the time I have this conversation time and time again. It's thinking, why don't we get ROI? And it's thinking, well, maybe you've got the right tool set, maybe you've got the right people, but do you have the right strategy? Whether that's a 5-year strategy, do you have the right roadmap in place? And I'd love to see what you've seen from your angles, from doing this research and maybe past knowledge of what it is for how industries, companies, whatever you want to pick on, can have the confidence to navigate these, because it's some great points that you've highlighted in the report.
Yeah, I mean, I think a couple of things, maybe connecting a little bit to what Trevor was suggesting, as well as your questions, Tom. I mean, I think, an interesting part of the survey as I read through it again and kind of process it and think about it relative to the experiences that I have with my clients is, I think a lot of the things we used to think about as distinctions, like, IT versus the rest of the business, transformation versus enablement of the customer and employee experiences are really quite blended. And the distinctions between the two are difficult, or maybe even not that important to make anymore. In other words, I can't do very much of what I want to do in the business to generate return without making meaningful changes in the technology space. And thinking about those as being distinct is I think in our data, we're seeing that people are less and less to think about those things as being distinct. When we used to talk about, there is no business strategy, there is no IT strategy, there's just strategy. I think in the language of this, and as you sort of unpack some of the things that might appear to be a little bit inconsistent with one another, it's because those distinctions are not so crisp or quite as meaningful anymore. I'm not surprised to see, kind of a response that says, I still have, budgetary constraints, even though I'm demonstrating meaningful return on the budget that I have, because, budget constraints, particularly around aspects of the survey, like cyber. A client said to me just yesterday, we can literally spend as much as we have on cyber, and we would probably still be facing threats, because that's the nature of the threat landscape. And so there are certainly, pressures to make sure we're spending in the right place, to make sure we're making smart kind of bets in this technology. But I also think that the idea of a IT spend and a business ROI are concepts that are losing meaning, because it's really, technology working together to deliver some sort of outcomes that does have, meaningful, observable impact on business.
Yeah,
I think another. Oh, go ahead, Matteo.
Oh. All right. So when I think about, more broadly from a technology wave perspective, right? I usually look at things that are more cyclical in nature, and other they are, long-term disruptors, right? I think when it comes to cyber, particularly, we experience a long-term disruption. We are meaning like we are not going back, and that's driven primarily by two things. Number one, cloud. So cloud has completely changed the paradigm of where we think about, securing things. Right? It's not a perimeter anymore because the perimeter is gone. And the second is the engagement model that we have with clients and with people, with employees. Right? We are living in a truly hybrid society. So if that's the case, the risk posture that we see with the majority of risk officer is evolving, and it's evolving quickly because the head of business are requiring for the risk posture to evolve, right? And so we start seeing that evolution about how do we embed the risk posture in the technology itself. So with things like policy as code taking place, we start thinking about how we drive automation into cyber capability, whether we use AI to do that, whether we use DevOps to do that. So there is an element of how risk is evolving. And then the third element, which you alluded to, is this notion of what it would take to be best in class, what it would take to be North Star when it comes to the entire, construct of it, right? Which is not just managing threats, but is also being leading in data privacy and data compliance. And in some of the work that we have done for large organization, that cost is in billions, right? So going back to the point of where does it fit in the broader investment posture that some client needs to take is very, very significant. And to some degree, that might be reduced by democratization that this new technology are bringing to the market. But regardless, it's highly complex and it's highly transformative. And one more thing that I want to say, that doesn't even take in consideration that there is two elements of it, right? So as we embed AI in the work, we automate and we drive costs down. But the more AI we embed, the more explainability we also need to drive, and the more potential risk we're taking on, because there is threat in AI itself that's in the system, right? So we are doing quite a bit of work in the firm to figure out how do we actually bring cyber protocols in the AI that runs in the system of our clients. So there is an element of that as well that increase the complexity of what client need to deal with.
And I think another stat from the report that shed some light on what looks like, but I don't think is a kind of ceiling a little bit on technology spend, is that the second largest driver for adoption of enterprise technology, which is not all technology, but is agility, or to accelerate agility. And I think, and what it's referring to there is almost certainly business agility. But what we're finding, and what I've found for years, right, there was a point at which you couldn't add any more engineers to a team to get more output from the team. I've got a client that's got 5 divisions. In one of the divisions, they're massively accelerating their business, and they have 4,000 or 5,000 engineers. And we kept hiring, and we just weren't getting output. And eventually we, which we pointed out a little bit earlier than you might expect, it wasn't just about doing more work, it was about doing the work differently. And partly that is the adoption of literally of Agile or Scale Agile, but it's not just a sort of formal process, although sometimes that can help quite a bit. It is taking a more modular approach with the types of capabilities that you build, whether it's data science or data engineering or cloud engineering or cyber, and composing teams differently than we have when we were just sort of adding to the pile of engineers or just piling data scientists on top of data scientists on top of data scientists. At a certain point, that gets inefficient. And so I think what you're starting to see now is not quite a pause, because I think there's continued growth for sure, but a pivot to reorient the organization, the process, the culture, to bring things further upstream in the design of digital platforms, the design of AI implementations, so that, as Matteo said, legal and risk issues are not something you do check at the end, but that you look at the beginning. And what that leads to is a much more efficient use of the resources that people have, which is required partly because people don't have infinite resources, and because businesses need to be able to respond to economic shocks, to war, to pandemics, to whatever the next thing is. You need to be able to shift to respond to customer needs, which, as we have all discovered, can shift much more quickly because of uncertainty than we had before. So I think it's that move to agile, which means it's not just about spending, buying some more tech or buying another cyber solution or, another 1,000 engineers. It's about how do you rethink how everyone's working, how you compose teams, how you kind of measure the success of those teams and things like that in order to make sure you're actually delivering or you're learning and you're delivering business outcomes.
By the way, I think that's a really super point, and something that to me in the cloud statistics particularly comes to life. So if you take a look at the degree of adoptions we've already discussed and satisfaction with that, you do see a stratification in outcomes. But then you look a little bit further and say, what are the outcomes that people are most taking to the bank? They talk about cost savings and efficiencies. In my experience, neither cost savings or efficiencies are experienced just because you've changed the technical platform, just because you've moved to the cloud. It suggests that the distinction between those who are seeing high ROI and people who may be seeing a less of a return is because they've been purposeful about thinking through the ways of working, whether that be on the IT side or on the collaboration side between the technical professionals and the business professionals. And so there's a story in here about the triumph of technology. There's also a story in here, I think, about the triumph of management and recognizing that we've got to change the way we do things as we take this journey.
Yeah, I think one of the things on the back half of the report, as an internal challenge, and I would assume this would actually transcend not just to cybersecurity, but also in general for strategy on the technology side. There's a lot of interesting, cues that we can point to over the last 10 years of, technology tooling, enabling more efficient process. And you mentioned, platforms not being the only thing, but I can't help to think, if we look back, 10 or 15 years ago, or the .com bubble, when everybody, wanted to be a web developer and pets.com was worth, whatever it was worth. Right. And we saw this kind of like blooming of technology, and then there was a contraction, right? And kind of like this epiphany of like realization. I'm curious, from your guys' perspective, like what, as I've seen things like Squarespace and Wix and these like easy to do things, platforms, adding more decentralization of small businesses like Shopify to do business and really stratify, a niche in their market that may not have been there. I'm starting to see more and more of an emphasis on the same thing and, low code development, no code development. And it's allowing kind of like business minded or, industry specific individuals to actually kind of garner some excitement about the technology in a different light, as opposed to this kind of like, I've got to use Excel to crunch decision or Monte Carlo models, right? So can you kind of like, I guess the interest of the entire report, can you just touch a little bit on tooling and how you see the progression of people who are not necessarily technical per se, getting more excited about the adoption of some of these platforms and systems and tooling that enable them to get more interested and excited about what people are doing in the space?
Yeah, I can start. So as you say, one thing that's been there for a long time is the sort of core of what we think of as, when you think of a data scientist or you think of a full stack engineer, it's that sort of development effort or something like that. And what's changed is sort of a spread into two other areas. One area is that citizen developer model that you described. And I agree with you. It is partly well, partly it's the sort of the skill of, you know, your average 23-year-old, which I find absolutely terrifying these days.
Social
You know,
media.
they can code, they can, you know, they can sing, they can cook. You know, it's unbelievable on some level, but it's also you know, and we see this within our own organization. I lead the tech organization, but the tech organization doesn't have a monopoly on technical skills, and so we are actively enabling via low-code platforms, via AutoML platforms, via, you know, data platforms that we've, you know, assembled ourselves. You know, people to start to do their own development in the course of delivering value to clients, and you see that at some of our best clients. You see massive transformations of the way the finance department works, you know, which involves efficiencies, but also, you know, profound value that's being generated in the intersection of, you know, for example, finance and HR. The other direction, which is completely different from that, is the productionization of these systems. You know, there weren't as many people around, you know, 10 years ago, as you say, to take the really clever data science and actually put it somewhere where it could run. And the irony was, it literally was, as you say, a kind of technical problem. It was, I mean, there was an element of like, do we trust it? You know, is it really stable enough? But actually it was just, are there engineers that have the technology available to deploy that, such that if it's going to reroute the pipeline, we can be confident that at 2:00 in the morning on a Saturday, it's not going to, you know, reroute it in a way that, you know, we all have to get out of bed to deal with, kind of thing. And so the rise of data engineering, you know, and I keep having to sort of remind myself, you know, 15 years ago, data engineers were, you know, the people that had to sort of go line by line through the data and make sure it looked okay, kind of thing. Now data engineering is engineering. You know, it's people that actually have a discipline around building data-driven systems such that they run reliably, are scalable, you know, report their, you know, their errors in a way that's useful, et cetera. So it's that spread from pure R&D and development out into, one, the sort of democratization and widespread into other areas which aren't technology. But the other thing is that technical discipline, that, you know, to get the stuff literally running at the core of a business.
Yeah, maybe what I can add, at the risk of maybe being very basic, right? When I think about the space and I think about infrastructure, if I think about application, I think about data, right? Obviously, those three components need to come together to achieve, Trevor, what you alluded to. On the infrastructure side, we have seen this great democratization with cloud, right? So pretty much anybody, regardless of, you know, your reach, your complexity, your buying power as organization, can get compute and storage now fairly easily on a credit card, right? We have seen unification, democratization of app modernization, primarily with Kubernetes, right? And now fundamentally, when we talk about, you know, cross cloud, right? We talk about that, and low code is fairly effective when you have a microservice, you know, architecture underneath that allows, you know, citizen developers to be effective in that space. I would say the bigger constraint at this point is still the data layer or the data backbone. I feel that Snowflake has shaken the market to some degree by separating computer storage, right? And the fact that you know, you can host a Snowflake environment where, you know, on any cloud. But we're still dealing with proprietary data silo, right? Snowflake is still proprietary in the way they keep their code set up, and we have seen really friction in this space. We have seen Microsoft and Satya Nadella try to push the envelope with the Open Data Initiative a few years back, but, you know, SAP, Adobe, they didn't necessarily go along with it. But now we're going to see that coming and surfacing, right? Because as the application layer, as it becomes more integrated through container, through Kubernetes, now you want to have an open data backbone that includes things like SAP and Oracle and Salesforce and all of it, right? And until that happens, right, it's going to really be hard to achieve that level of maturity that we want to see in the market, right? So, but I'm optimistic that we're going to see disruption on the data side. and we're going to see acceleration on bringing together an open data ecosystem the same way we have seen it with infrastructure and with apps.
And Trevor, there are a couple things in your question that maybe I'm taking in a slightly different direction than you intended. But start thinking about, things like citizen developer and moving what might have been traditionally technical contributions into more of the user population, if you will. And I think that's a natural evolution of the maturation of technology, and it's exciting. It's totally exciting to see, what sort of things that allows people to do in their work and in their interaction with their customers. I think it is possible to extrapolate from that into sort of a dangerous space, which is to say, boy, if I've moved all of this, formerly technical contribution out into what we used to think of as the user community, maybe there's not a role for IT. But I think in Matteo and Paul's comments, you hear there is obviously continuing and rapid development of technologies, which requires, as we mentioned earlier, real engineers, real architects, real skills. And there is a responsibility in the IT function that oftentimes we don't think about, which is I need to make sure this is secure. I need to make sure that I can protect information and privacy. I need to make sure that I can support the regulatory context in which we are working. And that is something I don't think you can move to a user's responsibility. I think that's a dangerous idea. So, it's popular now, or at least provocative now, to think about, maybe we don't need an IT contribution in the future because technology has just moved that far. I would say I feel exactly the opposite. I think the value proposition of the IT capabilities in the organization may evolve, but I don't think the role of the CIO has ever been any more important than it is today, and what it will be tomorrow.
Yeah, and I think on that note, in terms of pure efficiency, I think that's where I guess the true delineation between the term engineer 10 years or software engineer 10 years ago is going to change. And I think to your point, the architecture and the knowledge, and I agree with you on the fear point of, you don't necessarily want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. Just because you can have Squarespace build you a website doesn't mean that people should not be able to code raw HTML, CSS, JavaScript, right? So I wholeheartedly hear your point on that. And I think that's where I've heard so much contradicting information that when you look at, a lot of C-suites and you look at the reports and statistics that we've got in here, it's one of those things where people, start to say they almost like desensitize or devalue in some senses. Like, well, yeah, my 23-year-old kid can spin up a website. Like, why do I need to pay a developer $20,000 to build a website? But those intricacies that you're talking about, where architecture matters in certain scopes and industries, is I think the huge delineation factor of what actually is required nowadays to be quote unquote called that software engineer, and I think that's definitely noted for sure.
And just to add, I think there's a clear distinction between there's an interesting ongoing effort to try to figure out exactly what citizen developers should be focused on, and I pointed to like massive transformations of the way the finance function has worked, or the HR function, or the procurement function. In some respects, what that is a kind of elaborate expansion of the use of calculators when it works well. And I mean elaborate. It's not. I'm not being patronizing. What you don't, you still get, and I get our citizen developers or client citizen developers who kind of, grab a copy with me and they say, I developed this predictive model and it's 98% accurate in predicting X or whatever. And I'm always like, oh. Coming back to when you see the 98, 99%, you kind of hit the side of the screen of the computer. I'm like, typically like models that are 99% accurate are broken somehow, so there's a question of a little bit what it's for. But I think the interesting version of that comes back to something Matteo was talking about, which is as the use of AI starts to permeate more and more of the business, more and more of what we do in government, and more society, it raises the bar in terms of the degree to which we need to think about responsible AI, and that's a real discipline, and it's a complex technical discipline, but it's also a complex, policy discipline, risk management discipline, and that's not something. It's not to say citizen development doesn't have a role in it, but you have to be very, very careful. You wouldn't want to create a recommendation engine that was developed by a bunch of kind of people part-time. or an engine that set the sort of prices for your credit card or something, that people developed over lunch when they were all getting together to work on some interesting stuff. It might be interesting to see the results of what they did, but if you're going to put that out in the world and have it interact with customers and make an offer to this group of people and that group of people, you need to think about what data did you use to do that? How did you prep the data? How did you check the data? Everything, up the stack of responsible development, and that is something that as the expansion of the use of this stuff continues, we've had to continue to double down on and developing real process around that, because you need to build that into the deployment of these things, not kind of loop back around when someone notices it's malfunctioning in a way that's that's socially or increasingly legally unacceptable.
Yeah, I would say also the organization, they are more mature in this space. When I see them, they do it better. They move beyond this concept of personas, right? And they think more in terms of a continuum, right? From pro code to low code, right? And it's really a continuum, right? And you need to serve at both ends, right? And in the middle. And if you start thinking those terms, I think you're gonna have better result than to try to deliberate and spend a ton of time to define job roles that are going to evolve in 6 months.
Yeah, you guys have talked about some pretty, specific, tangible things. I in this report, and I'm trying to understand, obviously, the nuances of some of the obstacles. How are you envisioning and seeing terminology benefiting or being a deficiency when having conversations with leaders around, people think AI, and you just brought up responsible AI, right? And there are a lot of people who talk about AI, and everybody has their own preconceived notion of what artificial intelligence is. From it's just Siri and Alexa, and they listen to me, to very complicated PhD scientists who understand the mathematical nuances of gradient descent, et cetera. So can you kind of talk about, and this will be my last point, but how you think that terminology over the last couple of years has impacted the type of stats in this report? What are people feeling more comfortable with terminology wise? What are you seeing being less adopted in terms of, maybe it's fear tactics or concerns around cyber? Can you guys touch on that a little bit? Because I feel like there's probably some nuance to the report that also engages the type of terminology that people are using on a day-to-day basis.
It's a great question, and I think a challenge of almost any survey instrument, particularly one of a global scope, is to work as hard as you can to be as precise as you can, recognizing that, frankly, I think as an industry, these, as you pointed out, Trevor, these words don't have an entirely shared meaning. They have sort of a substantially shared meaning, but maybe not an entirely shared meaning. And so there is, kind of real, I would say, a requirement, frankly, on the parts of people like us here in the chat room today. People who are advising clients, people who are writing for the industry, to kind of continuously remind, okay, what do we mean by this technology? Let's put this in context. And I would say, a substantial part of my role in advising clients is just establishing the shared semantic, so that we can move forward and really solve the problem. Like any survey, I think there's a real obligation to say, okay, let's understand the items in the survey, let's understand the responses, make sure that we are interpreting it correctly. Certainly, we try to take that on as we do our analytical work. But I look forward to people who are consuming the survey and doing the same thing. Let's really understand what this means to us, and have we taken the right understanding of this language. And any survey, I think, or frankly analysis, really demands people get beneath the statistic a little bit, really interrogate what that means to you, and let's have a conversation about it, because there's a lot of nuance in these responses that are worth spending some time on.
Yeah, and I think there are certain words which are still problems. I had a recent client experience where we were, as part of a project, trying to sort out where architects should live in the organization, and we had like the sort of modern technical equivalent of the who's on first conversation. People were talking about software architects and network architects and enterprise architects, but it was just architects. And the way I ultimately resolved it is I banned the use of the word architect from the conversation. I said, we can talk about where to put these people, but no one can use the word architect until we're done. And that worked, and it's because architect is one of those things which in its current usage means everything and nothing kind of thing. I think we are, and these things go in cycles, right? AI used to mean something very specific, and then it literally like referred to anything that had like a blinking light on it. I think what's happened in some cases is that we've come back around to a little bit of precision, at least for now. And I think that to some extent has to do with the maturation that we've referred to of the ecosystem, because you can quite easily point to companies that can help you with AI versus companies that can help you with, a digital platform versus companies that can help you with finance ERP. And and I agree, there's always a bit of drift, particularly as Barry said, when you're talking to, companies, 1,000 companies across the globe or whatever, but I do think that there's precision partly because the proliferation of meaningful technologies that are one thing or another thing or could do both has created not a kind of a common agreement about what we're referring to, but a little bit more density than existed for maybe 5 years ago, when automation in particular and AI essentially just referred to all of technology.
Yeah, I would say our team, our Lighthouse team in particular, spent significant time in attempting to demystify this very exoteric concept and academic concept of AI, particularly with executive, right? And I feel it was beneficial, but I don't think we necessarily moved the needle to where it needs to be. Although I think I tend to be more optimistic this day, because in the past year and a half, I see a lot of organizations driving data literacy initiatives. And as part of this data literacy, they start measuring the percentage of decision they are driven by insights. And typically analytics is not really truly ML AI, but they start also measuring what level of automation the decision is taking place, which is really correlated more to ML model and AI model, right? And because now it becomes part of the telemetry and the vernacular of, something an executive can understand, right? What percentage of my decision are driven by insights, right? Now, all of a sudden, AI and ML becomes something that has more tangibility in the context, right? So I feel that is very positive, right? Because we are not talking about cognitive services or broader concept. We talked about what's the impact to a business decision in the business. At the same time, the goalposts are moving, right? And so we see with GPT-3, with GPT-5, capabilities in the AI space are become more general, right? And we're getting a step closer to general AI. I'm not saying we're going to have AGI tomorrow, but we have seen some very impressive results on these massive libraries. And the context of engaging with those massive library with OpenAI, for instance, is moving the definition, right? For instance, this concept of how do I prompt to engage an output on a summarization model, right? That's something we never discussed with an executive in the past, because it wasn't even real 6 months ago, right? So on one hand, I feel optimistic that reality, the use of AI is becoming real in the analytics and the broader insight context. On the other hand, I recognize that technology is moving extremely quickly, and we need to continue to do work to make it real for our execs.
Yeah, I think that's some brilliant points. It's really interesting. And I was looking through that, maybe switching up gears, what you're saying about the learning curve and how people use different terminology. I hit it all the time. There's an interview we did with ISG with Wayne Butterfield, and he was saying it drives him crazy. Like, you've got intelligent automation, then you've got hyper automation, then you've got RPA. And he was just like, he's like, I'm someone that's a practice director in this area, and he's just like baffling me from time to time. So it's that whole education piece, and it's a great episode. If anyone watching wants to go check it out. But I guess I want to be really respectful of your time, and I hope you don't mind sticking around for a few minutes, because I want to ask this key question while I've got you all, Matteo, Paul, and Barry. And from our angle, I mean, I always say I started the AI Journal because I went into engineering and I didn't understand. It was mainly on the robotics side and looking at machine vision, and I thought, I don't know what this is. I need to learn very quickly, and I had to do a lot of late night reading. But when I look, there's a quote here from Michael Natush, that's in the, I hope I'm saying that right, in the report, who's Chief Science Officer at Prudential. And it says, technology debt is never considered an issue for people who are focused on innovation because it will never hinder them. It's only once you hand over to the execution teams, which need to run the show, that it becomes an issue. So I want to kind of look at this, and I think that quote stuck out to me. There's a number of great quotes, but maybe just quickly going around, Barry, Paul, and Matteo, starting with you, Barry. What do you think of the technical debt issue with silos and culture being a problem? Because there was 35% in cyber that highlighted it in the report, and there was 30% in cloud. So it's clearly an issue. And I look at it from, if I'm going, I completely missed the point from times. Some people don't like certain companies in Asia, and other people don't like certain companies in America because it hinders their value. And it's the exact same thing with technology, which I'll admit I sometimes forget because I just think what people like it. Like it speeds up their day. What's it all like? What do you think about all of that, especially around the silos and culture being a challenge for the C-suite or the company as a whole, the industry as a whole?
Yeah, I mean, a couple of things, and frankly, a great question, particularly coming off of what we were just talking about, because I think technology debt is an example of a phrase that has very different meanings depending upon who you are speaking to. And I suspect part of that is what came out in our survey. I mostly interpret the tech debt responses, and we very purposely this year were asking questions about tech debt because our hypothesis was exactly to your point that this is getting in the way of if not getting in the way of the pace by which they're able to deliver digital transformation. I believe that it does. It's certainly getting in the way of some of the ROI math. Like we ended up spending a lot more money because we had to confront this technology debt problem. And the results of the survey didn't come back, really supporting that hypothesis. But here's what I made of it. I believe that tech debt is a concept that people confront, I think, both on the innovation side and on the execution side. So I think that quote is quite provocative and interesting, but I think the degree to which it is surfaced is quite different. Right? In an innovation context, we're just solving the problem, and I don't know if I bothered to label it tech debt or what have you. In operations, I'm having to deal with operational realities. Sometimes that looks like, hey, this aspect of the solution or this particular silo of interaction is a piece of the problem, and I sort of call that tech debt. What I mostly took away from the survey responses around tech debt is, I think, unambiguously a critically important thing for people to be addressing and understanding. It is rarely a basis for investment. So I'm not going to go do a digital transformation and predicate that investment on a retirement of tech debt. I'm going to do that work on a basis of a number of business outcomes, and I think we're seeing that people are achieving those business outcomes. And along the way, I'm going to have to confront the tech debt story, and it will probably frustrate me along the way. I think that's probably a fair observation. But if people are responding, why are we doing this? I don't think tech debt is the motivation. I think it is part of what the innovators help solve for and the operators help eliminate.
Great point.
Yeah, and I think there's challenges that companies have that are in the general vicinity of tech debt that aren't tech debt. There's a really large banking client of ours, and I'll slightly modify the numbers to protect the innocent. And they spend close to, let's say, $13 billion a year on technology. And of that 13 billion, well over 9 of it is spent on the maintenance of a bunch of stuff that's been running for years and years and years. Now, $3 or $4 billion is a lot to spend on the new stuff. But it's still not anywhere, it's a great minority of the tech spend. And I think, as the complexity, particularly of a multi-line financial institution or any decent sized company grows, you do have the challenge that a significant part of the problem that companies are solving for is the cost of running these systems. We did a recent project, which was not just an enterprise architecture project, but it was literally just let's look at your systems, let's reconfigure it, let's come up with roadmaps, et cetera. And we took 25% of the back office cost of technology out of the run of a very large beverage company. And that's a massive amount. They were like completely shocked that anything close to that was feasible. And so I think that does hold people back. But I think there's another quote in the report, which is I think the real challenge in that regard, and that's from Standard Chartered Bank's Rowena Everson, where she said, if you attempt to achieve 100% level of certainty over everything, you're hoping for a false level of precision. All this will do is paralyze experimentation in the business, which will ultimately paralyze growth. And I think that's the real key. I think tech debt's a challenge, but the reason to solve for tech debt is not to just spend a higher percentage of the budget on new stuff. It's because we are solving for a set of problems that we don't fully understand. If we've learned anything the last 3 years, we need to be prepared for uncertainty. Uncertainty is different from risk. It isn't like we know there's a bad outcome and there's a 5% likelihood of it. There are things coming down the pipe, good, bad, we're not sure which we need to be ready for, even though we don't know what they are. And the right model for tech innovation and tech investment and tech build and platforms and data architectures is one that it gives you the flexibility to respond to that, to experiment in certain directions without betting the farm on the future of your bank or the future of your retail chain or the future of your government department in such a way that you're ready for what comes. And I think that's the reason that we need to solve for that, because we need to free up resources, not just to run the bank, but to put it on very different footing with regard to uncertainty.
That's a great point.
Yeah, maybe if I can just add, and I think, Paul, that was a great point. I like the quote. I think is accurate, right? If you think about innovation as such, typically takes place on target state, infrastructure and technology, and you somewhat insulated by, legacy and tech debt. But when you think about the transformational digital journey at large, you're going to face the barrier of tech debt in stages, right? Mm-hmm. So if you think about like the cloud journey, for instance, a lot of organizations lift and shift, right? Their legacy application to the cloud, they get immediate benefit, right, just by running on the cloud. And so tech debt is not a major hindrance. Now you start moving modernization, now becomes more of a problem, because while you modernize it, you still need to address some of the tech debt that you had to modernize, right? Similar with data, right? When you start moving more and more model into production, now you are only as good as the data that's beneath those models and those insights. And so I think depending on where you are on the journey, you're gonna face those barriers. And to some degree, even for organizations that are ahead of the journey, they face new barriers, right? Data monetization is a good example, right? You might not think of the tech debt when it comes to data monetization, but it's certainly there, because you're going to start dealing with privacy and sovereignty challenges. Unless you can solve in better modern ways, it's going to be prohibitive to monetize on your data effectively. So I think it's everywhere, but it's a little bit different depending on the stage of the journey.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And I think everything that we've discussed today has been really eye-opening to me. I mean, the report itself, but Paul, Barry, Trevor, and Matteo, for you all expanding on it. And just to quickly check, I'd like to start with you, Trevor, then go around Barry, Paul, Matteo, before we close this session, which has been really insightful and really helpful. We'd love to try and give as much value to our audience as possible and to anyone watching at the moment. What would you say is the biggest learning from each of you, if you can, in 20, 30 seconds, if that's possible? And maybe what has it changed your forward look from what we've seen in the report? Has there been a certain angle that's pointed out to you, or is it a generic kind of this is really taught me something? What do you think, starting with you, Trevor, then to Barry and Paul, then to Matteo?
Yeah, I think just briefly, it's encouraging to know forward thinking that culture is still as big of a hindrance to technology. I think, one of the things that I was thinking about as you three were talking about, the last comment was, more and more people are going to be a lot more agile when it comes to technology and the ability to, go from an existing system to a new system that may have an easier user interface. And I think that's part of the buffer now, that if I'm looking at this research report and saying, with talent constraints that we have globally right now, the biggest initiative that excites me and gives me, encouragement is that, in 10 years, the majority of the workforce is going to be so much more agile around the ability to adopt new technologies, new interfaces and components and tooling, that it's going to give us a better sense of hopefully shifting the maintaining balance, like you were saying, Paul, from, 8 to 9 of the 13 to really maybe 50-50. Or even maybe more on the emerging tech side. So that's what gives me encouragement. I think moving away from the cultural barriers specifically warms my heart. So.
Love it.
I think for me, what I really enjoyed seeing in this report is there was some speculation. How would we emerge from the early stages of the pandemic, and what was that going to tell us about, who we are, what we contribute as a technology function? Did we take 3 steps backwards as part of the pandemic? Did we, what really happened? And part of what I read in this report is, we had a tough number of years as we were dealing with all the repercussions of the pandemic and other things going on in the world, and we came out of that quite strong. We are much stronger in these notions of technology, digital transformation than we were going in. And in fact, what we used to consider to be a distinctive characteristic is now, sort of the norm. Which tells me, we have done a reasonably good job of making the most as technology professionals of what was a really extraordinarily bad moment in history. And I think that's gives us a lot of optimism as we continue to move forward.
I love it.
I think what some of the report tells us reinforces for me the idea, which we talk about a fair amount, which is that all technology is business technology, or at least should be. That coming back to that original statistic, 99%, of the respondents generated returns from digital transformation. I mean, it's sort of mind blowing. And while there are some technologies which are demonstrably business technologies, I mean, SAP's finance modules are there for business purposes, despite the efforts of some SIs to occasionally try to turn them back into raw technology. There's other things, and Matteo talked about this, common technologies like Azure and Databricks, which are clearly meant to do something for a business, but part of the challenge of what we're working through is what exactly is the impact that's supposed to have. Moving data from point A to point F back to point B, it needs to happen, but for what, towards what end? And what's clear is that the businesses that responded to the survey are very much working through and motivated by the process that we are going through, and the KPMG is really committed to, is to try to figure out, whether it's a mature technology like a Databricks, or whether it's an emerging technology like quantum or, GPT-3, what is the role that this can have in the way a business does business, in the way it grows, in the way it becomes more efficient, in the way it works with customers. And I find that really exciting.
Maybe Matteo, to finish off.
Yeah, it's hard to add on some great points, but I'm not sure. I think what Satya Nadella said, maybe technology is the only real deflationary force, and if you think in those terms, the sense of optimism that came out of the study, the survey around both the progress that we have seen organization across the spectrum and have taken, as well as the momentum with technology. I think when you think about that, you walk away with a sense of encouragement, particularly when we live in tremendous uncertainty, both from a society, from an economy, and from a social economic perspective. So that's the main takeaway for me, and particularly as the technologies, I love it.
Yeah, it's really interesting. It's some really impactful as well to see. The optimism is what I picked out of it, because sometimes you read things and you think, that negative thing to say about it. So I really love the challenges that are clearly there, but the optimism to say how we can overcome them, how businesses, how industries, and that kind of cross communication to make it better, to make this technology more impactful and give more resource to companies and to better initiatives. So I really love it, and I want to thank each of you again for joining today, Barry, Trevor, Paul, and Matteo. And as always, we've done a few of these with the team at KPMG. Learned a lot today, as always, which is why I always say it's a selfish reason I love to do them. But also learning from your point of views and hopefully learning from each other as well. So I just want to say again, thank you for joining us, and to everyone watching, I really appreciate it, and look forward to hopefully doing this again, maybe in person. It'll be a lot of fun.
Very good. Thank you.
Thanks.
Cheers, everyone.
Cheers.